Chapter 11. Just over a week later, Kathryn sat alone in her room and finished reading the last of her magic assignment again. In the beginning, she feared Jacob had tricked her. Since she didn't believe in the goddess, she didn't see how asking her to activate a spell would work. Sighing, she closed the book and traced its indented designs with her forefinger. She must really like me. More likely, she liked Jacob, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with Kathryn. While the other candidates struggled to perform their spells, she could perform hers on the first try. The second day, she read the fire spell in the common room and created a small fire globe in her palm. Awed and with a happy smile, she looked up to see the others staring at her, frowning. She had packed up her things and had left the common room. Learning afterwards from Riel that the other recruits had been trying to perform the fire spell for hours without success, Kathryn could see how they would think she had showed off and probably resented her now. The language barrier prevented her from going back down to the common room to explain, afraid she would only offend them somehow. Even Hal seemed annoyed that she could perform a spell on her first try, while it took him about 20 tries to get it right, if at all. Not wanting to further embarrass her fellow candidates in class, she seldom raised her hand to show the assessor that she had mastered the spell. Assessor Jakara interpreted her lack of participation as ineptitude. Whenever he spoke of other people whom failed the class, he would always look at her with a scowl. She had learned to despise that arrogant ass. Riel had spelled all of the directions to be in English, so Hal and Kathryn could read them without a translator. Last week, Kathryn had decided to read ahead and learn a few more spells. She had ended up reading the entire book and could perform the spells without thinking. The book of spells consisted of pages of long alien words that she found somehow familiar, with their pronunciation, a detailed description of what each one did and how to counter or block it. Although she never let it show, she was terrified. When she would read a spell, she would know how to pronounce it before she looked at the pronunciation guide. Instead of learning the spells, it was like refreshing her memory. She knew Jacob's memories seeped into her mind, but the creepiness factor still made her feel inadequate. She hadn't heard from Jacob since his condolences. Cheating never appealed to her, and this felt so much like copying someone else's paper. Kathryn didn't trust herself. She had learned something else early on. When she had first attempted her water spell, she had looked at the wooden bowl, pictured the spell in her mind, and then before she finished uttering the spell, the water had already formed in the bowl. After several experiments, she found she could invoke the spell without speaking the incantation. With that and the sights, she just didn't know who she was anymore. Even with Jacob's slow trickle of memories, the flood of change overwhelmed her sense of self. She jumped as a knock sounded at the door. Opening the door, she found Hal standing on the other side with a desperate look on his face. "May I come in?" Nodding, she stepped aside. I finally built up the nerve to speak with the other candidates. They were pretty wary at first, but thawed when I started asking them if they could help me with my spells. He looked embarrassed before he continued. "I would have asked you, but I didn't want you to think I was stupid or anything. I'm desperate at this point. I've never had this much trouble in my life learning something." "Which spell are you having problems with?" she asked. All of them," he said with a grin. "The other candidates are in a similar situation. They've learned one or two, but only if one of them gets lucky and teaches the others. After seeing how easily you performed the fire spell, they were embarrassed to approach you. I convinced them that you didn't bite. Could you come to the common room with us and give us a few pointers? I didn't realize you were having so much trouble." She felt guilty, feeling self-pity because she could perform the magic without a problem. "I'll come down right now." She turned for the door when Hal spoke. "Won't you need your magic book?" He pointed at her desk. She realized there was no point in lying. "No, I don't need it. What would you like to work on first?" Kathryn glanced around the large table at the group of candidates. "Well, we've finally cast the fire and ice spells, but we can't seem to master the water spell at all. I think Lesser cast it once, but we can't seem to cast it a second time." Deterra, a tall, lean young man with a friendly face, shook his head. "Well, try casting the water spell, and maybe I can see what you're doing wrong." "I'll try," Diterra focused his attention on the small bowl in the center of the table. A hush fell over the table as he stared at the bowl. Wakethia! Perfect pronunciation, but she could tell he was just saying the words and not feeling them. No water appeared in the bowl. The frustration in his eyes was plain, but he took a deep breath and looked to her for guidance. You pronounced the spell correctly, but what were you thinking when you cast the spell? What was I thinking? I was thinking about all of the syllables and emphasizing the correct ones, hoping the goddess would understand what I was asking, about how much of a fool I must seem to not even be able to cast a level 1 spell. He sighed with resignation. What else should I be doing if I pronounce the spell correctly? When learning new spells, the pronunciation is the key, but you need to use your mind to cast the spell as well. She gathered her thoughts, trying to make everything as simple as possible. You can't just think about the word. That's all it is, a word. You need to think about what the word means. Water. Think about how refreshing it can be on a hot summer day. When your mouth is as dry as dust and your throat aches for moisture, you'd do anything for a drink when the heat of the day feels like it will consume you. Now try casting it again and thinking about the meaning of the word before you utter the incantation. Diterra looked thoughtful as he looked at the bowl for a full minute. Wakethia! The bowl filled with water as Diterra's eyes lit with the joy of accomplishment. I can't believe it was so simple. This whole time. Such a basic concept, yet it makes all of the difference in the world. Thank you so much, Lady Kathryn. It was my pleasure. Would everyone else like to try? Everyone around the table nodded as they worked for hours to achieve a goal they had all been working on for days. Kathryn thought the sheer exhaustion of teaching the other spells for most of the night would help free her from sight for at least one night, but she was wrong. The final battle sight hit her as soon as her head touched the pillow. The death and destruction increased in detail, leaving her with a sick feeling in her stomach when she awoke just after midnight the next morning. Remembering the smell of blood and burning bodies, she threw up into the bucket and knelt upon the floor in front of the tub, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. She realized going back to sleep was not an option. She decided to walk down to the library, hoping for some type of escape for her mind. On Earth, she loved to escape from the routine of everyday life with a good book. She found herself in the section containing old scrolls and tattered books, dealing with nothing but incantations and magical theory. Magic most likely triggered all of her sights, so maybe she could find a way to get rid of them or control them. She glanced at what titles she could read and chose the first volume from a multi-book series entitled Incantations of Avlor. After she removed the book from the shelf, she noticed on the front a piece of paper attached to the cover that read The Lost Spells, Book 1. She brought the book to a well-lit table and opened it. The book, similar to her spellbook from class, had beautiful illustrations and notes written in the margins. The first incantation, the communication spell, seemed simple. It was a spell that mimicked telepathy and allowed someone to silently communicate from one person to another, or to large groups. Knights used the spell often during battle, to issue commands, or to call for reinforcements. The incantation was only 4 syllables, but she felt as though something wasn't quite right. The incantation read, Lagath or Vat. It should read, Lagoth or Vat, which meant mind speak. Kathryn remembered the library having parchment and a type of pencil to keep notes, so she retrieved some and wrote down the correct spelling of the communication spell. She made sure to reference the book and wrote a quick summary of the spell description. Spending a few hours immersed in the Lost Spells book, she found most of the other incantations misspelled and suspected the author must have been dyslexic. The incantations consisted of high-level offensive spells, such as fire and lightning, several physical and elemental shield spells, and a knowledge spell. The knowledge spell allowed a person to cast the spell on a book, which passed on the knowledge of its pages to the caster or the caster's target. The knowledge spell came with a warning about using it for books of incantations, as those required extensive study to learn each incantation. However, it recommended the spell for learning languages, although only practice would allow a person to speak them fluently. The temptation of the spell was too great. She found herself sitting in another part of the library with an Avlorish to English dictionary. With her left hand touching the side of her head and her right pressed flat upon the book, she cast the knowledge spell. Lakoth menima dorath. Nothing happened. She then remembered her own teachings from last night and tried to imagine what imagery she needed for a knowledge spell. She remembered all of the frustration of not understanding those around her and the humiliation of her ignorance. Knowledge was power, but it was also a lifeboat that kept a person from drowning in the loneliness of ignorance. With that in mind, she cast the knowledge spell again, hoping for a result. Lakoth menima dorath! Her head dropped to the table as she blacked out. She woke up a short time later to the dawn light shining through the library window onto her table. Her head ached, but she wasn't sure if that was from the lack of sleep or the knowledge spell. Most likely it was from her head hitting the table. She quickly returned the books to the shelves, grabbed her parchment, and headed back to her room to get ready for her class. She didn't want to leave her papers where anyone might come across them, so decided to store the parchment in a small hollow area underneath a loose stone in the floor she had made last week while experimenting with the teleportation spell. It had only taken her 2 attempts to move a chunk of the rock floor to the courtyard outside her window. Supposedly, she'd eventually be able to get dressed in her armor in an instant with that spell, but she had a hard time believing it. After she washed up and donned her uniform, she laced up her boots just in time for Hal's usual knock on the door to go to breakfast in the mealroom. Enter! Hal opened the door with a tired expression on his face. I'm so exhausted. I never knew how tiring casting spells could be. You look awful, by the way. I just thought you should know. He didn't even crack a smile. You really know how to cheer me up, Hal, she said in a sarcastic tone, and surprised him with a smile. Wow, you must have had a good sex dream or something. You don't normally smile until after lunch. He frowned, but his eyes smiled and let her know his sense of humor overcame his exhaustion. Come on. Let's go eat so we have plenty of energy for Sir Lancelor to beat us with the flat of his sword. She strapped on her sword and closed the door behind them. As they gathered their breakfast onto their wooden breakfast plates, they looked for a place to sit in the crowded mealroom. The mealroom resembled a huge cafeteria, but with comfortable chairs and nice wooden tables. They sat at an empty table in the back of the room and began to eat warm bread and fresh fruit, the customary breakfast of this world. They ate in silence, their norm this early in the morning. Kathryn generally tuned out the hum of Avlorish while she ate, but now she found she couldn't ignore it. She knew it was Avlorish, but she could understand it as if it was English, not even needing to translate it into English in her mind before she could understand it. She held her bread before her mouth and just listened to the conversations going on around them. Is something wrong, Kate? Hal sounded concerned as he looked at her in confusion. I'll talk to you about it later. Not here. Okay, whatever you want. He shrugged it off and they finished their breakfast. For the next few hours, she listened to Riel translate all of Sir Lancelor's Avlorish for her. In a sense, she had to listen to every conversation twice. She found that Riel translated most of the conversations, but chose to ignore anyone whom insulted them in some way. Kathryn heard some of the candidates, none of whom she helped train last night, make a comment about her sword work. She can't use a sword very well, and she never volunteers for a spell demonstration. It'll be a miracle if she makes it into the Knighthood, one of them said with a sneer. Another answered, If she does make it, it'll probably be on her back. The other snickered to this and quieted as Sir Lancelor glanced their way. He shook his head and looked at her. With her angry stare and clenched fists directed at the other candidates, he tilted his head as if he had pieced together her understanding of their words. The rest of the morning her anger transferred to her sword while she drilled with Hal. Hal always held back to keep the pace with her. Her anger increased her speed and power, but she could feel what little energy she had left ebbing away. Are you okay? He asked between bouts. You seem agitated. I'm fine. I just have a lot on my mind. She reined in her anger and finished the rest of the training without incident. On her back indeed.